In 1975, a $100 bill could do something that sounds almost ridiculous today. It could buy weeks of groceries. It could put hundreds of miles behind you. It could cover a surprisingly large chunk of the rent. And if you were willing to spend the whole thing at once, you could walk into a store and leave with something substantial, not just a cart full of everyday necessities. But there's a catch. People didn't earn today's salaries in 1975 either. So was $100 really worth that much more? And was life actually more affordable? To find out, we're going shopping in 1975. And we're starting somewhere that makes the difference immediately obvious. The grocery store. Walk into an American supermarket in 1975 with $100, and you're carrying serious grocery money. A gallon of milk might cost around $1.50. A dozen eggs could be roughly 75 cents. A loaf of bread was around 30 cents. Ground beef could be less than $1 a pound. A pound of bacon might cost around $1.50. Coffee was roughly $1.20 a pound. A pound of bananas could cost around 20 cents. And depending on where you lived and what you bought, $100 could fill a shopping cart remarkably well. Of course, comparing individual grocery prices across half a century gets complicated. Brands, package sizes, quality, and regional prices all changed. But the difference is still striking. Imagine buying milk, eggs, bread, chicken, ground beef, potatoes, cereal, coffee, vegetables, fruit, and all the other things a family needed for the week. Your $100 wasn't disappearing after 2 bags. It could represent a significant portion of a family's monthly grocery budget. But before we declare 1975 a paradise of cheap food, we need to remember something. The federal minimum wage was only a little over $2 an hour. That means our magical $100 represented roughly an entire week's gross pay for someone working full-time at the federal minimum wage. Suddenly, that shopping cart doesn't seem quite as cheap. And that's going to become important, because price tags only tell half the story. The gas station. Now take that $100 to a gas station. America had just been through the 1973 oil crisis. Drivers had experienced gasoline shortages, long lines, and rapidly rising prices. By 1975, gasoline averaged somewhere in the neighborhood of 57 cents per gallon nationally. So theoretically, $100 could buy roughly 175 gallons of gasoline. Obviously, your car couldn't hold that much. A typical American car of the era might have a large fuel tank, but even filling a 20-gallon tank would cost only around $11 or $12. That means $100 could potentially buy 8 or 9 fill-ups. There was another problem, though. The cars weren't exactly sipping fuel. This was the era of enormous sedans, station wagons, and V8 engines. A big American car could return fuel economy that would make a modern driver stare at the dashboard in disbelief. So gasoline was cheaper, but Americans often burned considerably more of it. And just a few years earlier, the oil crisis had demonstrated something uncomfortable. Cheap gasoline wasn't guaranteed. The automotive industry was already beginning to change. But if you think $100 at the gas station sounds impressive, wait until you see what happened when you took it home. Rent. Housing is where 1975 starts looking almost fictional to modern Americans. The median gross monthly rent in the United States around this period was measured in the low hundreds of dollars, not the 4-figure rents common in many places today. Depending on the city, $100 might cover a substantial portion of a month's rent. In some cheaper markets, it could get surprisingly close to the entire thing. That sounds extraordinary, but there's another number we have to put next to it. Household incomes were dramatically lower too. The typical household wasn't bringing home $70,000 or $80,000 a year. Nominal household income was measured in the low to mid-teens, and borrowing money could be painful. Mortgage rates were far higher than the ultra-low rates Americans became accustomed to decades later. The 1970s were also being hammered by inflation. So while the sticker price of a home might make a modern buyer want to build a time machine, financing that house wasn't necessarily easy. Still, housing represents one of the biggest differences between then and now. Over the decades that followed, housing costs in many American communities would grow much faster than ordinary consumer prices. The $100 bill was losing power, but in 1975, it still had another trick: dinner and a movie. It's Friday night. You've got $100. You're feeling irresponsible. Let's go out. A movie ticket in 1975 cost roughly $2. 2 tickets? Around $4. Even after popcorn, drinks, and dinner, you weren't necessarily approaching anything close to $100. A fast food hamburger could still be measured in cents, rather than several dollars. A full fast food meal might cost around $1 or $2. Restaurants varied enormously, of course, but $100 could buy dinner for multiple people at many ordinary establishments and still leave enough money for entertainment afterward. And entertainment itself worked differently. There was no Netflix bill, no Spotify subscription, no internet bill, no smartphone plan, no collection of monthly digital subscriptions quietly nibbling at your bank account. But that doesn't mean entertainment was free. Cable television existed, but most households still relied on broadcast television. Movies required a trip to the theater. Music meant buying physical records or tapes. And if you wanted to watch a particular movie at home whenever you wanted, well, that was about to become interesting. The home video revolution was still in its infancy. A new generation of machines would eventually let Americans record television and build personal movie collections. But early home video equipment could cost a small fortune. Which brings us to the electronics store. What $100 couldn't buy? Here's where nostalgia runs into reality. Electronics were expensive. Very expensive. $100 wasn't buying you a giant television, a computer, and a phone. Those products either cost much more or, in the case of modern personal technology, effectively didn't exist yet. Televisions represented a significant purchase. Stereo equipment could easily consume multiple $100 bills. Calculators had only recently begun dropping dramatically in price. Home computers were just beginning to emerge as products for enthusiasts, and the smartphone in your pocket today would have seemed like science fiction. This is one of the strangest economic reversals of the past 50 years. Some things that were expensive in 1975 became astonishingly cheap for what they can do. Computing, telecommunications, televisions, photography, music, information. Today, a relatively inexpensive smartphone replaces a telephone, calculator, camera, map, encyclopedia, newspaper, alarm clock, radio, television, and much more. In 1975, you needed separate products for most of those jobs. So while your $100 went much further at the grocery store, gas station, and movie theater, modern technology gives us capabilities that couldn't have been purchased for $100 at any price. But there was one place where $100 really could make you feel rich: the department store. Walk through a department store in 1975 and $100 gave you options. A pair of jeans might cost around $10 to $15. A decent pair of shoes could be purchased for a fraction of $100. Shirts might cost several dollars each. Basic household appliances were often within reach. You could potentially walk out with multiple outfits instead of one premium item. Catalogs from retailers like Sears and JCPenney were essentially snapshots of American consumer life. Furniture, clothing, tools, appliances, toys, electronics, everything was there. And those catalogs reveal something interesting. Not everything was dramatically cheaper when adjusted for income. Some manufactured goods represented serious purchases. Clothing, for example, was often expected to last. Americans generally owned fewer pieces of clothing than they do today. Fast fashion hadn't transformed closets into rotating inventories of inexpensive garments. Goods were repaired more frequently. Shoes were resoled. Televisions were serviced. Appliances were fixed. Throwing away an expensive product because one component failed wasn't always the default. That $100 could buy more, partly because Americans often consume differently. The new car. Unfortunately, our $100 shopping spree ends quickly at the car dealership. A new car in 1975 typically cost several $1,000s. So you're not driving away with one for $100. But your $100 could represent a meaningful piece of a down payment. And compared with modern vehicle prices, the numbers can look astonishing. Popular American cars often had sticker prices somewhere in the $3,000 to $5,000 range, depending on the model and options. Even luxury cars could have prices that look absurdly low today. But again, wages matter. If you earned $10,000 or $15,000 per year, a $4,000 car was a major expense, and cars of the era lacked many things modern drivers consider standard: advanced airbags, backup cameras, electronic stability control, modern crash structures, navigation, Bluetooth, automatic emergency braking, modern fuel efficiency. You were buying a lot of steel. You weren't buying a lot of computers. And that brings us to the biggest purchase of all: the house. This is the number that tends to cause the most time machine envy. The median price of a new American home in 1975 was roughly around $40,000, depending on exactly which measure and part of the year you use. Today, that number wouldn't buy many new cars. So imagine walking into a real estate office with $100. No, you're not buying a house. But that $100 represents 1/400th of a $40,000 home. Apply that same proportion to a $400,000 home today, and you'd need $1,000. That's a crude comparison, but it demonstrates how radically the numbers have changed. There were important differences. Homes were generally smaller. Fewer had luxury kitchens, enormous primary suites, or multiple bathrooms. Interest rates were higher. Modern building standards and amenities didn't exist. And where Americans wanted to live changed dramatically. Still, housing affordability has become one of the clearest reasons people look back at earlier decades and ask, what happened? The answer isn't simply inflation. So what is $100 from 1975 worth today? If we adjust purely for overall consumer inflation, $100 in 1975 would have purchasing power equivalent to several $100s today, roughly in the neighborhood of $600, depending on the exact month and inflation measure. That's why the old prices sound so strange. A 57-cent gallon of gas wasn't really equivalent to spending 57 modern cents. That 57 cents came from a paycheck denominated in 1975 dollars. The same applies to that $2 movie ticket, the 30-cent loaf of bread, the $40,000 house. Looking at historical prices without historical wages creates a distorted picture. But inflation adjustment reveals something even more interesting. Different products didn't rise at the same rate. Some became relatively cheaper. Some became dramatically more expensive. Technology became vastly more capable for the money. Many manufactured consumer goods became cheaper. Meanwhile, housing, medical care, education, and certain services became significantly heavier burdens for many households. So asking whether life was cheaper in 1975 doesn't have a simple answer. It depends on what you're buying. The paycheck. Suppose you actually lived in 1975. You wouldn't have today's paycheck and yesterday's prices. That's the fantasy everyone wants. Instead, your salary would shrink along with the price tags. A household earning $15,000 per year wasn't poor, simply because that number sounds tiny today. Those dollars had much greater purchasing power. But Americans were also dealing with a serious economic problem: inflation. The country had recently experienced a recession. Oil shocks had rattled the economy. Unemployment was high. Prices were climbing quickly. Economists were struggling with stagflation, the unpleasant combination of inflation and weak economic growth. People living through 1975 weren't sitting around marveling at how inexpensive everything was. Many were complaining about how expensive everything had become. That's perhaps the funniest part of looking backward. The generation paying 57 cents for gasoline remembered when it had been 30 cents. The family looking at a $40,000 house remembered when homes cost $20,000. Every generation compares prices to the world it remembers. The $100 experiment. So let's spend our $100 one final time. It's Saturday morning in 1975. You fill your car, you buy groceries, you take the family to a movie. Maybe you grab dinner afterward. And depending on exactly what you bought, you could still have money in your wallet. Try recreating that exact day today for $100 and things get difficult very quickly. But now reverse the experiment. Take today's smartphone, high-definition television, instant communication, streaming entertainment, modern car safety, medical technology, and access to nearly unlimited information, and try buying those things in 1975. You can't. Some didn't exist. Others would have required technology available only to governments, corporations, or research laboratories. And that's why comparing 1975 with today gets complicated. We didn't simply make everything more expensive. We changed what people buy. We changed what houses contain. We changed what cars can do. We changed entertainment. We changed medicine. We changed communication. We changed what Americans consider a normal standard of living. And somewhere along the way, the humble $100 bill changed too. In 1975, handing someone $100 felt substantial. Today, it can disappear during one trip to the grocery store. But people in 1975 didn't know they were living in an era of incredibly cheap prices. To them, prices were going through the roof. And 50 years from now, someone may look back at what we paid today and wonder the exact same thing. How did everything used to be so cheap?